Hi there. This is a segment that we call the psychological traps of diabetes self-care. Most of us as healthcare providers are quite invested, highly motivated to help our patients. The unfortunate part about diabetes management is that it's not so much about what we know and the goals that we have, because so much of diabetes outcomes are associated with patient behavior. A huge amount of this knowledge translation really requires the patient to follow through. And what we discover is that there are opportunities, or there are times when our efforts to help people actually backfire, and that these efforts, rather than supporting change, actually interfere with change. We call those psychological traps. This is about a 15-minute presentation. It's a PowerPoint presentation. So I hope it's useful to you, and I'd be very curious in hearing any feedback. And we'll have a discussion board that can help you identify any questions or discussions that might stem from this this module. So I hope you enjoy it and it's useful to you. Thanks. I want to begin this module by having a look at a quote. And this is a book that was written about chronic disease by physicians. So this is physicians with chronic diseases writing about their experiences. Individuals, of course, who have this wonderful opportunity to be on both sides of the desks. And here's a physician, a British physician called Gwendolyn Austin. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 6. And when asked to represent for her academic audience the experience of living with diabetes, and in particular the care she received around diabetes management, here's a couple of quotes that she said. First, she says, "I have endured many and varied diabetologists, and my overall impression is that few of them are normal human beings." So what's going on there? How can this relationship be, rather than seen as supportive and helpful, be seen as almost inhuman? Second comment she makes is obsessionals are selected into medicine, but many patients cannot follow the same principles in life, such as perseverance and delaying gratification. Physicians often cannot accept what many patients feel. That is, a lengthy, neurotically preoccupied life is not as worthwhile as making the most of the present. So these comments are very helpful to us because they allow us to see the context in which many of these relationship issues form. And so where we go with this is the following. More than just jargon, I want to identify several specific traps, psychological traps. And I call them a trap because what they indicate is that we're trying to help, but maybe it doesn't work out so well. And we can categorize these into 5 issues. 1, what we call psychological reactants. 2, dysfunctional expectations. 3, learned helplessness. 4, the abstinence violation effect. And 5, issues associated with the pace of behavior change. And let me go through each of these relatively succinctly. First, let's talk about psychological reactants. And what do we mean by this? Psychological reactants, as it turns out, is actually a very normal, healthy psychological experience. And basically what it reflects is that people will resist being controlled. So psychological reactance is the tendency to act the opposite to what one is asked to do. Reactance is related to the issue of control and self-determination. So if our relationship with our patients are such that they feel that we're not controlling them and that we're respecting their decisions and their right for self-determination, then things will go smoothly. But if they feel that we're taking charge, if they feel that we're actually telling them what to do, and that interferes with their ability to make their own decisions, they might resist. What's important about this is that they might resist even if they ultimately want what we're recommending. So they may have the same general overall goals that we do, and nonetheless, they will resist our attempts to help them. If a person feels control is being taken away, then free will is limited, and then as a result, it is normal to resist. Here's an interesting study published a number of years ago, and all I am showing you in this particular slide is the percentage of individuals whose blood glucose records, as downloaded on a meter, match what they recorded in their book. And you can see that just about half of the recordings were actually underchanged and underreported. And so what this really reflects is that there's a tremendous problem with regard to simply telling the truth. What's interesting about this study is the population that they used. They actually were studying university-educated women who were pregnant. And we all know that they are the most likely group to be adherent. So what was going on? How can individuals, why would they change these numbers, knowing, in fact, that the meter is going to be read? and downloaded. And the reason, of course, is that they're feeling judged, and they're feeling like that there's something that is interfering. And there's many sources of judgment, and that's why I say we don't stand a chance. Driving to the clinic, it's our clinic, not theirs. That takes people control away. We register. Patients register for us, rather. They prove themselves with their medical cards. They sit with others, so they're no longer individuals. So these are things that make individuals feel very reluctant to, very sensitive to the control dynamic. And they, of course, come in our offices, sit in our chairs. It's the pictures of our family members that they might see, not their own. So because of that, we need to be careful to reduce that tendency for patients to feel like they're being controlled. And we do that by questioning. And some of the important and helpful questions: do you believe that you should do what we ask, and why? That just allows an open conversation about who's in charge. Because many times patients don't tell us, they just assume that we're controlling them and are resistant because of that. If we ask these questions, it gives you the opportunity. Do you ever think we ask too much of you? Some people tell us that we don't recognize just how difficult it is to put our guidelines into practice day in, day out. Can you see their point? Tell me more. Do you feel that we are in charge, or are you? So if you ever expect or anticipate or suspect that there's a reactance going on, that the patient is actually engaged in behavior that's resisting you, perhaps psychological reactance is happening. And these are some questions that can help you be guided through that. By the way, when you ask these questions, ask them several times, because when you initially ask these questions, patients are uncomfortable, and they hear these questions in a way that they're not comfortable with. So they tend to tell us what they think we want to hear, or they just blurt out an answer. And if you find ways of repeating the similar questions multiple times, then that can be very helpful. Anchor yourself in the reality of your patient's world, not your own. So remember to think about what your patient experiences and how much of their behavior can be normal given their own world, rather than thinking about the world that we live in. As best you can, be non-defensive. If patients challenge us, try not to resist them. Be cautious of your expectations, and I'll have more to say about this later. And above all, remember that it's not about us. Patients aren't here to do what we tell them, that it really is a negotiation about outcomes that affect their health, not ours. This leads us to the second issue around traps, and that is the expectations that everybody holds around diabetes management. Consider the following questions. Imagine you're a person with diabetes and you've finally gotten your blood sugars under control. Now what? How long should this behavior last? If you ask this question, most patients will, well, of course, now that I'm in control, I should stay in control. In other words, it should last forever. If it doesn't last, how do you feel? Patients will tell you, I feel like I've failed. I feel like I've let myself down. I feel like I've let you down. How do others react when control slips? Same thing. Not well. I feel I've let them down. I feel disappointed. It's a negative experience. So think about what we're saying here. We have this subtle, implicit expectation, as illustrated in this slide, that the degree of self-care should be standard and high. In other words, we should get up into this zone of adherence and be following it indefinitely. And that just is not reality. That is not the way the world works. It is not the way behavior works. What's much more consistent with behavior is drifting in and drifting out. And so what you see is the following. When expectations are set too high, you get this up and down pattern. And what happens over time is two things. One is that when the person tries and then they drop and they try again, they work hard, and then if they can't sustain that, when they drop further. Then they work hard and they don't get up as high, and when they fall further. And over time, what happens is the person gives up. And this is called learned helplessness. The person has learned to be helpless. And this tendency to, when you let go, to let go even more, is called the abstinence violation effect. So when we hold our expectations rigidly high and we are unable to achieve that, in other words, if we can't be perfect, we tend to give up. And that allows us then to become really impaired in our ability. So let's talk about the abstinence violation effect. So basically the person is like, I'm going to be in control. I vow to abstain. I'm not going to eat too much high-fat foods. I'm going to exercise. I'm not going to sleep in. So they make this sort of this commitment. And then despite that vow, they give in. So I go to the party, I promise myself I wasn't going to eat, and I start eating. So that's the, sort of the abstinence piece, is the setting this expectation. And the violation piece is that despite the expectation, I don't stick to it. And what is the effect of that? The effect is I've blown it. I might as well blow it good, get it out of my system, and start again tomorrow. And what's important about this is that this is what we call uninhibited behavior or disinhibited behavior. In other words, the person just doesn't sort of loosen their standards. They go too far in the other direction. And in particularly with food, it's important to understand, because food also has that additional effect of soothing the person. So if the person feels like a real failure, then sometimes they might turn to food as a way of managing that emotion as well. So those things combine. This is as good as it gets. No behavior lasts forever. It's not falling off the wagon that's the problem. It's taking too long to get back on. So we need to negotiate with patients and help them to understand when they slip, what are the factors that are leading to that? How do we support them keeping back up so that you can get the pattern as above? How do we limit our dysfunctional expectations? Avoid comparing a patient's behavior to 100%. Compare it to 0. For instance, patients don't have to test their blood sugars. They don't have to eat healthy. They don't have to take their medications. So, there's no rule saying that they must. They're being asked to for the purpose of improving their diabetes control. But basically, if we're comparing their behavior to 0, it will show us what they're doing. If we compare their behavior to 100%, it'll show us what they're not doing. And that can lead to learned helplessness. Avoid the temptation to expect behavior to be a constant. Expect behavior to cycle. It's normal. And again, remember the expression, it's not falling off the wagon, but how long and how far it takes you. If you and the patient can explain the behavior, you can work with it. In other words, if you understand what got in the way, that becomes kind of a barrier, gives you an opportunity for problem solving to engage the patient. And also, distinguish effort from outcome. A person might put a lot of effort into something, and it may or may not benefit in terms of actually achieving the control. And we all see this. People can put a huge amount of effort into bringing their sugars down, and they discover that it doesn't actually affect their sugar all that much. Or they work hard to reduce their weight, but their weight doesn't come off to the extent that they had hoped it would. So this is how to limit dysfunctional expectations, which we believe is the primary source of learned helplessness and abstinence violation effect. So to just elaborate, remember that effort doesn't equal outcome. Right? Only count behaviors the person can control, right? So for instance, it's not so much the weight on the scale, but the number of days active, the number of healthy food choices that are really associated with sustained health. And the patient needs to be flexible. Remember, our efforts are dependent on the situation. So a 10-minute walk in January is more of an accomplishment than a 30-minute walk in July. So by taking this context into consideration, it can really help people with sustaining efforts. This leads us to the issue of the pace of diabetes self-care. Diabetes healthcare professionals are like 100-meter runners. Those with diabetes are like ultra-marathoners. Who runs faster? Who wants to get to the goal line quicker? So we have to remember this, that it's not so much our pace, but it's the individual's pace that needs to be matched. And of course, this is where there's tension, because if we're working with somebody whose pace of change is very slow, we want to do everything we can to speed it up. And that's where the tension comes in. But at the end of the day, it's the patient's journey, not ours, and we can remember this. And that's where we find the benefit, the relevance of teachable moments. Also, it's important to determining the timing. Don't be shy to ask your patient, is this a good time to change? And then for us all, to handle the anxiety of a patient pace slower than the healthcare provider's pace. Be careful with the number of behaviors, quote, on the table. And this is a challenge in diabetes, as many of us are aware. There is a tendency for us to think about all of the things the patient needs to do. Often we'll put a number of behaviors on the table, even though it may be the case that patients are incapable of achieving all those. So what I've done is summarize what we would see as the major psychological traps, that is, ways in which our efforts to help, if we're not cautious, might actually harm. So good luck. Thanks.